So we will look at how people come to some of their conclusions about some of these things, and um, what different uh, uh, faith traditions, how they read their particular eschatology in some of these verses. So we will look at that. So you'll at least have an opportunity to kind of have this balanced perspective of what's out there. But even in the midst of that, again, I want to underscore that there is a message. There is this ultimate message that sometimes is lost, which is being prepared to witness in the difficult days to come. When he speaks of, these end times and these end days, he's not just speaking about it. I'm just saying he definitely ain't speaking about it so we can go around, woo, we scared, and we those Left Behind movies. Those was a major way of evangelizing church folks, right? That was a major push for, we see young people. How many of y'all participated in a youth group where you had to watch the movie? You sat down and watched the Left Behind, whether it was the one that came out in the 70s or the one that came out in the 90s. You watched a Left Behind series, and that was kind of that was the church's version of being scared straight, being scared safe. How many of you all had that experience? Yeah, right. That was you remember those Scared Straight series where they, you kind of, you watch have all these interviews with people who are in prison and all that kind of stuff. And they done lived a life, and this is supposed to scare you on the straight and narrow, right? Well, the Left Behind series were the church's Scared Straight, scared saved, for lack of better words. That's what we, and the whole thing is not necessarily for us to walk away or scared. Ooh, I mean, all this stuff that's going to happen, and it's the idea is that yes, there's going to be some difficult days ahead, but he's telling us these things so that we can be prepared to be witnesses in these difficult days. So we'll talk more about that. So let's dive into some stuff. Matthew 24. Some of this first kind of introduction is really parts of my dissertation. Is not necessarily new information. Not all parts of dissertation is really new information. Sometimes it's just setting up the issues. And so this is kind of most of this. A lot of this is just kind of sections from stuff that I've written. But let me see if I can kind of lay out the major ways of interpreting Matthew 24, and I'll do it by way of Mark 13, which is the same, essentially the exact same stuff. Scholars tend to the scholarly consensus tends to be that Matthew has gotten majority of his material from Mark, and about 97% of what's in Mark is in Matthew. And so, and Mark has gotten a lot of this language in this chapter, what is called the Olivet Discourse. He's gotten it from the Old Testament. And so Matthew could have gotten it from the Old Testament too, but there's probably some element of some payoff of understanding that Matthew is modifying what Mark has. So there's two major ways to look at this, and then in coming days we'll talk about eschatologies like dispensationalism and amillennialism and postmillennialism and how they read that. We'll talk about some of this, but just as a way of exegesis, there's just two major ways of understanding this, what is called Olivet Discourse. One is that the passage largely addresses the second coming, what we is included as the parousia, or the second coming. The other one is that it refers to the destruction of the temple or the destruction of Jerusalem. In Mark, I believe that's exactly that the language is largely about the destruction of the temple and destruction of Jerusalem. But there is some language, that makes it difficult. That makes it difficult to just make it about that. So the other side of it is that it's also about when the end of the world. So is it the end of for the lack of a better word, the world as Jewish people know it, i.e. the Jerusalem, the temple, or is it the end of the world in general? Before we move on, I think there's an interesting connection there, because sometimes, if I can say it this way, sometimes because our world is all we know, sometimes in history, the end of my world is oftentimes described as the end of the world.
Right.
Mm-hmm. What distinction am I making there? The end of my world versus the end of the world.
Right.
What distinction? Can anybody elaborate, you think, on what I mean by that? Come on.
I have an example.
Yeah, come on.
From Genesis with Lot's daughters.
Okay. Yeah.
They got their daddy drunk.
Yeah.
And had sex with him because they thought it was the end of the world.
Yeah.
Carry on his name.
Yeah. And it is one of those things where it wasn't the end of the world. It was just they thought it was the end of the world, but it was just really the end of their world, so to speak.
Right. Solomon and Gomorrah, yeah.
Yep. Anybody else? Any kind of yes, Christian? Yep. Exactly. Christian said the end of my world is my personal thing versus end of the world is everybody's. And in history, we typically that's exactly right, Christian. We sometimes we struggle to make a distinction. So for a lot of people, the end of my world feels like the end of the world. Every great nation, every great regime has come to an end.
Mm-hmm.
When in World War I, that's why they was referred to there as that's one of the reasons, apart from the fact that he almost had all the nations of the world warring. But in World War I and World War II, and where you had in World War I, you had kind of a pandemic, or close to World War I, a kind of a pandemic. You had like all this kind of stuff going on. You had people at war. You had all this kind of stuff. And you could imagine a lot of people thinking, well, this is it. He coming back.
Yeah.
And then World War II, the invention of the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord. You talk folks having like nuclear missiles and atomic bombs. It's definitely the world is about to end.
Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes there is this that conflation, that convergence of ideas. And so America, people sort of, man, we going to hell in a handbasket, and all this stuff, and what we feel sometimes, what people think and project to be the end of the world is really the end of our world. The Lord is tearing up our personal lives, our communities, our countries, and after the Civil War, a lot of Southerners they just thought the world is just about to end.
Yeah.
It was like the worst thing in the world to lose their slaves.
Yeah.
And it was just terrible. In fact, we can trace how white Southern Christians' eschatology changed after the after the end of the Civil War.
Yeah.
When before the Civil War, white Southern Christians was more of they weren't dispensationalists. They were more kind of a millennialist and kind of, we'll talk more about that. But the idea is that they thought that they should fix the world, that they should try to change society systems and change the government. And so there was no concept of, for evangelicals, this idea of social justice. Right. All of it was about we should be light in the world and changing the systems of the world. And then when we try to influence the government and all that kind of stuff. And then when they lost the world and lost the war, lost their slaves, it was just like, well, what's the use then?
Right.
What's the use of this? And we might as well just, reclude in ourselves and focus on personal relationship with Jesus.
Mm.
Yeah. And in fact, we have adopted that language and didn't even know oftentimes that that's the historical context. So a lot of that personal relationship and personal sin was a pushback to, well, we done lost, so I'm gonna take my ball and go home then.
Right.
Yeah, what we gonna do? These ladies took my slaves. I don't know what the world is coming to.
Pastor, some of them committed suicide.
Yeah. I mean, it was just like, oh my God. So I want us to keep that in mind, that some of the language, and I do think that there is an element where Matthew is doing this in certain ways. Remember, he's speaking to Jewish people, and when he starts talking about, and we're going to look at this in a minute, the end of the temple, and the temple's going to be destroyed, and Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. For a lot of people, for a lot of Jewish folks, the temple was the center of the cosmos. It was the center of the universe, in the sense that it was, number one, the place where God ran the universe. It was the earthly manifestation of his heavenly temple. And so, everything, how they even understand and understood society, is all centered around Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem is the holy place, and the temple is the most holy place. And then going out from there is these what's called centrifugal circles, right? These, you have those circles, kind of like a dizzy, those things, and there's another layer of a circle and another layer of a circle, another layer of a circle outside of that, right? Where the farther you go away from Jerusalem and the temple, the less holy the place is. And so when they're exiled, the language is you're exiled to the ends of the earth. Y'all with me so far?
Yes.
Yeah. So there is this element where I think Matthew is intentionally using language that resonates with Jewish people about what would be the end of the world as they would perceive it. And I do think it has, especially in Matthew, it does have some components of not just the end of Jewish world, but the end of the world in general. But remember, he's talking about who are the witnesses. The witnesses are not necessarily just Jewish people. The witnesses are Christians who will make up of Jewish and Gentile people. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, we're going to look at some stuff, and we're going to look at just being witness in difficult times. So let's just see if we can lay out some of the framework here, and this will be an introduction, and then I'm going to close out with this application, kind of in the same way that I started, about understanding the difference between our world ending and the world ending. And so let's go from there. Let's start from there. So Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to the point to point out the temple buildings to him. So that's the setting. They're leaving the temple, and The disciples say, woo, wait, Lord have mercy. Look at these buildings, these temple buildings. And they're saying as a way of pointing out its magnificence and its beauty. And we see that in Mark. That's very specific in the Gospel of Mark. Verse 2, Jesus said, well, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. They're like, what? Wait a minute. What you talking about? Now, there are times when Jesus speaks of the destruction of the temple, like in the Gospel of John, that he's not referring to the temple building, but he's referring to his body, crucifixion, and stuff like that. He says, tear down this temple and I'll build it up in 3 days.
Yes.
But here, he's not talking about his life. He's talking about the actual physical temple. And he says, not one stone shall be left upon it. In AD 70, that will be fulfilled. Verse 3, he says, and as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, says, well, tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. We're going to deal with that in a minute. But as I said, that there's two major conversations about what is this? Is this about the temple, end of the destruction of the temple, or the end of the destruction of the world? Well, you can see how this conversation, how people will contextualize it as it's merely as the way of the destroying of the temple. N.T. Wright, a couple other major players, they take that perspective that it's just a destruction of the temple. R.T. France, a couple other people or whatever, some names that y'all may or may not know. But verse 3, where is it in verse 3 that says, he says, well, tell us when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? And then he starts going into, see that no one misleads you. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation. We're going to talk about the abomination of desolation, all that kind of stuff. What is it about verse 3 that would say, well, oh, he's referring to the destruction of the temple?
As he said on the Mount of Olives.
Okay. Yeah, that might establish a setting. I think that could be a cumulative argument, like one argument that could be added to that. What else? What's something probably
when will these things? They're asking when will these things happen? And the last thing that he talked about was one stone would not be left upon another.
Yeah, I mean, he says, Jesus says, do you not see all these things? Well, it's going to be destroyed. And then they said, well, what will these things happen? So the context seems to very much lead towards that idea of this is just about the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of a city. On the other end, there are some stuff that seems to say, oh man, it's something more than just the end of their world, so to speak, that this is like the end of the world. Mm-hmm. So language like, and because verse 12, and because the lawlessness increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all nations, and then the end shall come. Right? That tends to speak of something more than Jerusalem, because I mean, even in the book of Acts, right, the gospel is going out further than Jerusalem. Right. So that seems to argue that there's something more than just the end of their world, but the world. Then there's language of, Now, you might be tempted to say, oh, yeah, the wars and the rumors of wars. Like people say that all the time. Oh, I know we in the end of days. All these wars and rumors of wars, and just like the Bible preaching. I mean, that's been going on for centuries, right? And so that in itself, not by itself, wouldn't necessarily be. We have to take it in the context of all the other things that has been said. So you get that language, but then probably the big thing is that makes people think that this is more than just the end of their world, but the end of the world is the language that we get in verses 29 and 30. And it says, verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. Woo!
Yeah.
The moon will not give us light. And the stars will fall from the sky.
Ooh.
And the power of heaven be shaken. Oh Lord. Right? Now that, that's probably because of whatever. But that in our minds speaks of the apocalypse, right?
Right.
Woo, Jesus, the sun gonna be darkened, and the moon is not gonna give us light, and the star will fall from the sky. Lord have mercy. Then the Son of Man will appear in the sky, right? And so, but here's the thing: that language. Matthew borrows from Mark borrows from the prophets. That language, though, has a particular meaning in Scripture. Matthew's not the first to use it. It's used all over the place. And so this is important in this conversation too. So let's go to a couple of passages just to show you how it's used in the Old Testament. Go to Isaiah 13, verse 10. Isaiah 13, verse 10. Now, Isaiah 13, verse 10. So there are many, they all speak of these same signs happening in their time. They're these same language. We might be tempted to try to say, oh, he's talking about the end of the world. But no, if that's the case, then what relevance would it have to people in Isaiah's day? Right? If it's intended to be a warning for them, what the end of the world 2,000 years later, that ain't gonna have no significance for them. But he says, he uses the same language, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash their light. Watch this, verse 9. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, which is the day of the Lord is a day of judgment. It's a day of judgment for those who are not covenantally faithful, but it oftentimes will be a day of vindication for those who have been. But watch the language though. The day of the Lord is coming with fury and burning anger to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. Then he says, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash for their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Then I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the arrogance of the proud and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. I will make mortal man scarce or pure gold man mine. And I'll make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place to fear the Lord in the host in the day of its burning anger. And sometimes world can be used for land. But he says that. Now, the thing is that in verses 10 to 13, he describes this language. In verse 19 of that same chapter, he tells us, gives us a contextualization of who it applies to. He says in Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of childish pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So even though he says this language about the world, which also can be the land, will be judged and all this stuff, the land, the people who's going to get this destruction will be Babylon. Everybody with me so far?
Yes.
Okay, Ezekiel 32. I'll show you. Then I'm a close out after in a few minutes. Ezekiel 32, 7 through 8.
Okay.
I will make the land drink the discharge of your blood.
You.
As far as the mountains and the ravines shall be full of you. I will extinguish you. I will cover the heavens, darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. Similar language, but the language is a little bit more relatable to us, like, covering it with the cloud. Okay, that I can see how it's dark, but it's similar language. Verse 8, all the shining lights in the heavens I will darken over you and will set darkness on your land, declares the Lord God. I will also trouble the hearts of many peoples, and I will bring destruction among the nations and to the lands which you have not known. And so he says that, and then if you go to verse 12, by the swords of the mighty ones, I will cause your multitudes to fall. All of them are tyrants of nation, and they shall devastate the pride of Egypt. And so, so this is speaking of Egypt. So you get this pattern where it talks about this end of the world language, and then if you keep reading, you find out whose world. First Babylon, then Egypt, and a similar language, a similar thing can be made in the book of Mark. That he's referring to. He speaks of Jerusalem. He speaks of, and then uses this end of the world language to contextualize it. And so people speak of it in that way. That means, though, then in Mark, I argue that verses 24 to 27, when he says the moon will be turned to blood, the sun will be darkened, that he's using this language to speak of an end of a regime. In this case, is the end of a political world of the priest, and then which he's going to, in the end of the temple, in their political world of the priest, and he's going to establish a new world with a temple community where the church is the center. And so he's rebuilding a temple community. And so it is going to be the end of their world and the end of their age, and so to speak. And then this ushering in the church as a new temple community. Well, in Matthew seems to go a little bit further, though. He doesn't, where Mark says, watch this, Mark 13:4, and I want you to look on your handouts where I do a comparison. So in Mark 13:4, the disciples say, tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? And it's just like these things are just simply the ending of the temple and stuff like that. But in Matthew 24, he adds something. What does Matthew say? He says, tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age.
In the end of the age, yeah.
Yeah. So there's more in Matthew than in Mark in Mark, it's heavily saturated with Jerusalem and temple, but Matthew is kind of conflated, where the end of Jewish world, so to speak, is also conflated with the idea of the end of the world. Very, very interesting concept. Very interesting concept. We'll talk more about this later on, but this is perhaps there's some validity in the dispensational movement, although I think it goes too far in some areas of speaking of the dispensation of like the church coming in and stuff like that. So they have a leg to stand on, particularly in Matthew's gospel, because the way how Matthew presents it. Nevertheless, again, we'll come back to some of those stuff. I just want to kind of lay out some of those exegetical things, which is the language that sometimes, though, when we read language like the moon turning into blood, that we take that to be literal, and we have enough evidence in scripture where it's not used literal in the Old Testament. And so it's figurative language to talk about the destruction of a city, the destruction of a regime, the destruction of some type of infrastructure. So that's the first thing I want you to take away from that, is that we probably should not automatically default into thinking that that's literal. Once we do that, then once we get out the mindset that, oh my God, it's gonna be blood dripping from the moon, and the sun gonna go out. Once we get out of that language, how does that change? Right? How does that change your perspective as just even that little information? What does that do to your perspective of interpreting the end of days? If he's not literally talking about the sun, no, moon dripping blood, and the sun going out and all that, if he's not really talking about that, does that affect your perspective of the end of days?
Yes.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I'll say it.
Yeah, it does.
To be relieved.
Yeah, yeah. It's not. So then it's not like, probably what it does is it probably makes it less intense for us, less scary for us. And that's fine. That's good. And what I will say then is that, okay, fine. So once we got that out the way, there is a sense of urgency about the last days, but it ain't all that we've made it out to be.
Right.
In the sense of like, oh my God, it's gonna be, woo, so we walked through, and so what has happened is that we have focused so much on language that was never intended to be literal, that it has made so that our response to the end of days is to be one of fear,
Right.
which is counterproductive to the sense of what he wants us to be prepared for. He is not telling us this so that we can be walking around scared out of our minds.
No, he wants us to be prepared, right?
He wants us to be prepared so that we'll be ready to double down on our Christian witness. Listen, we can't be much witnesses if we walking around petrified.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
So that's where I want to frame this and moving forward. And again, we'll deal with some of the other stuff, because it is important that you at least, as I did today, it's important that we at least know why people are coming to certain conclusions, whether we agree with it or disagree with it. We need to know why, and so that when we're presented with that information, we have an answer for it. So I will deal with some of that stuff, but I want you to keep in mind that he's telling them this to prepare them to be witnesses in difficult days to come.
Right.
Let me say this as we get ready to close out. One of the things that is going to be very important as we prepare to be witnesses in difficult days to come is really wrestling with our perspective of Christianity, because you're going to mention things about the larger context of the world: wars, rumors of wars, famine, right? Earthquakes. And he said these are just birth pains. These are just beginning, right? And then, here's the key part, though. Here's the key part that we need to focus on, is that the pandemonium in the world will then create a culture where Christians become the whooping boys for people's frustration. And that's the key thing. So watch this. In verses 5, he talks about all the stuff, the wars, rumors of wars, nation against nation. And then he says in verse 9, then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations on account of my name. And so, and he says, and many will fall away. And so the thing is this, is that what we have to prepare for is that the more difficult, and this is important, y'all, the more difficult it becomes for the world, the more they're going to be looking for someone to blame.
Yeah.
And this has been a pattern in history, right? How is it that Hitler was able to come to power? Does anybody know? What were some of the things that Hitler used to come to power? Well, one of the things was this, is that Germany was struggling economically. It was in an economic mess. They were losing their jobs, and they were experiencing recession, and people were hurting, and people were suffering, and they needed somebody to blame. And so Hitler created what was considered a propaganda campaign, when he started blaming Jewish people. Start blaming, see, they're taking our jobs. The foreigners coming in, taking all our welfare and resources, right? Yeah, looking for somebody to blame, and people's frustrations start turning toward them, and then he started going from different stuff to not just blaming them, and then he, in order to really solidify that, he then looked to America to figure out, say, well, how does America able to do it? How are they able to denigrate Black folks and marginalize and create a class system in America, and still maintain this moral, like they just like the best moral example in the world? How is America able to do that? And so what he did is they hired scholars, some who had already studied in America, and some had were going to school in the South and different stuff like that. But they hired scholars and legal scholars to study America's system of Jim Crow and the Black codes and all that. And from there, he was able to come up with a system. They learned from America. But my point is this: is that you have these ideas. You have this. This is the same thing in Egypt, right? Is this when Joseph and Israel and all of them come into Egypt and they start multiplying, people get scared. The Egyptians say, "Oh, they're going to join our enemies with war," right? And there's this xenophobia, right? This fear of strangers. Well, here's the thing. The thing is this: is that as Christians, we are strangers in this world, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're in this world, but not of this world. Right. And so the more we are different, come on, now I need y'all to hear me on this. The more we are different, the more we become target practice for the world.
Yeah.
And in preparation for this, Jesus is saying, listen, I'm going to leave, and difficult times will come. And you all need to prepare yourself now for being different, for being distinct, and being okay with that. And that's important. That's an important message for us, because, see, as I talked about earlier, so much of talking about, the difference between my world ending and this world ending. Well, unfortunately, so much of our world is tied to this world. Yeah, so much of it. And so what that does is that we don't like to be looked at as weird as Christians. We talk about that, being conformed to the world and all that kind of stuff, but we don't want to be, we try to figure out, how much can I be the same without being, too
Right.
weird, and then what happens is then we buy into the systems of this world in the sense that this world becomes our world. It becomes the thing that makes up our biggest passions, that guide our principles. So many people's concepts of sexuality, even Christians, are changing because the culture's context of sexuality is changing. So much of our concept of what is right and what is wrong, right, is shaped by our culture sometimes, oftentimes. And so, at the foundation, I just want to get you this in your mind, is that as a close out, as we prepare for this lesson next couple of weeks, what happens if the Lord should allow your world, not the world, but your world, to be turned upside down? What kind of Christian witness? Because part of the strength of the Christian's witness is that we serve God whether we have good days or bad days. Part of our Christian witness is that that our God and our worship of our God is just not a matter of being a fair weathered Christian.
That's right.
That in stormy times, right, that we praise him for the good days and for the bad days. We understand, and yes, we don't necessarily look for suffering, but suffering doesn't necessarily scare us. In fact, we recognize that God is even at work, even in the midst of suffering.
Yes.
And so it is that theology that we have that is supposed to make us distinct. One of the things that makes us distinct from the world.
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism doesn't have a theology of suffering. In fact, Buddhism's whole thing is about the cessation or the ceasing of suffering.
Yes.
And the escaping of suffering.
Mm.
Maybe Islam has a little bit of it, but they got the wrong God. Right? You got some, and so there's this element here where part of our Christian witness is highlighted, is intensified, is expressed through our ability to suffer for the name's sake. He says, they will kill you. What verse is that? Verse 9. They will deliver you to tribulation, will kill you. You will be hated on the account of my name. We see a beginning of this in the book of Acts, where, like, for example, Acts chapter 4, one of the first times that Peter and John are this is the first time that anybody has been persecuted for his name's sake. And Peter and John, they're preaching, and they remember the lame man, and they says, we don't have silver and gold, we don't have, but in the name of Jesus, get up and walk. That puts them in problem with the temple elites. They say, listen, don't you preach in that name no more. It's like, okay, yeah, got it, roger that. And they leave, and they go straight out and they start teaching again. Like, mm-hmm. and he said, then they bring him and say, I thought we told y'all not to teach. Did we tell y'all not to teach in the name? So, yeah. Oh, about that. We rather serve God rather than man, right? Mm-hmm. And so they whooped them, and they beat them. They give them these lashes. And the Bible says, watch this, that they left there rejoicing.
That's right.
That they were able to suffer for his name's sake.
Mm-hmm.
This is, in order for us to even get there, we're going to have to be okay with being different. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, shoot, how can we prepare for suffering for his name's sake when we can't even, we can't even be, little stuff like, Halloween or tides, or like we can, like, little stuff, like we don't even want to be different from the world.
Right.
Like little stuff, like you go to church every Sunday, you're gonna bring your time, like like we don't like to for nobody to talk about us, our faith, that kind of stuff. And so, so at the foundation, Jesus is preparing them to be ready to be a witness. We're going to pick up on this on next week, but I want you to be thinking about sometimes he's already been preparing us in our own little context. When he's turned your world upside down and you have to be the object of ridicule from your family, when you got to catch hell on your job if you decide to be Christian on the job, right? When you got to just be like, he's giving us these little preludes of turning our world upside down, and then giving us an opportunity to say, now, what type of witness will you be if your world is turned upside down? Listen, if you can't be a witness if your world is turned upside down, you definitely ain't gonna be a witness when the world is turned upside down.
Amen. Amen, Reverend.
Yeah. If I had time, I'll leave you alone, but if I had time, I would tell you that Job was a witness of somebody who can be a witness when his world was turned upside down.
Sure enough.
So I leave you with this thought. How you gonna be a witness when the world is turned upside down, when you can't even be a witness when your world is turned upside down?
Ouch, 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 ouch.
All right, that's this is just a little introduction, just a little bit of introduction. We're gonna dive in it. Any thoughts? Any comments?